So, America's misguided admonitions to promote multiculturalism, in other words, to embrace our differences, is ludicrous and dangerous, nonsensical. Men are vehemently intolerant and astonishingly bigoted toward others who are different, a demonstration of man's sin nature. It's not going to go away, get worse. Instead of rejecting multiculturalism, American society is given a priority and explains away the resulting ungodly and unproductive behavior by saying, that's the way she is, or that's the way he was brought up, rather than live by the culture of the Christian upon which our country is founded. Men choose instead to live out the lust patterns of their own sin natures, vehemently insisting that they have a right to maintain their own cultural heritage, no matter how evil and counter to America's Christian culture. And I mentioned in the past about a friend I made in a job I had in Texas, and the lady was from a communist country, and she said it was a travesty that I owned 2 cars when I was younger. I said, well, I used one for sales, and my wife needed one because we lived in the mountains. Oh, no. You should have given that car to somebody else. Wow, how come you're here in America and you want to restrict Americans from having more than one vehicle? Really? One way of proving that multiculturalism is wrong is to carry it to its logical conclusion. Carry it to the logical conclusion. If multiculturalism is okay, then one cannot object to honoring the precepts and ways of the vicious neo-Nazi culture originally established in Hitler's Nazi Germany. Yes, that's their culture. Let's honor it. But they want to destroy everything you and I stand for, especially if you're not of the racist bent that they are. Nor the communist culture of Karl Marx, as instituted by communist China and Russia. Can the deadly enemies of communism and capitalism coexist and together with one another and prosper a nation? No, that's why communism failed. Capitalism is God's way. Look what China's doing now. It's sneaking in some capitalism to overcome America's capitalism and greed, and they're taking over, but they're using capitalism. Communism is Satan's idea. God's way is capitalism, but not American capitalism, a godly capitalism. You don't overcome or increase your capacity and taking over factories doing underhanded things either. And business versus unions and all these other things that are really an abomination to the theory of capitalism, that you own your own business and you receive the reward for what you earn. The resulting inefficient, abusive, petty, and bigoted behavior in the American workplace today violates safety and proficiency standards and destroys the concept of teamwork and enablement of others to do the best job they can for society and business. Yet this kind of behavior is permitted in order to conform to the rule of how one is brought up. All right, how about this? Ironically, this rule is often used to express dislike and contempt for another, gotta move this up, who is different, and to make life on the job unpleasant for them, rather than to enforce respect for someone's cultural background. The evidence for this is that it has been observed that this rule is invoked far less with friendlies of the same kind than with enemies of a different kind. It is interesting to note, for example, that most individuals who are brought up to put others down or to demand some kind of petty and submissive behavior when others enter their territory are usually quick to take offense at the slightest hint of the same behavior toward them. I remember a number of times as a temp, I worked for 15 years as a temp when the economy broke and I could no longer be a salesman for equipment to factories because the factories all moved elsewhere outside of America. So I ended up getting the temp job for the period of time, 60, 90 days, and then he said, we'll have to let you go. I said, why? Well, you're doing an excellent job, but you just don't fit in. In other words, I'm middle-aged and white and male. If this rule is a righteous one, and it is not, then how far is this rule legitimately carried into the workplace? Some workers, not having to comply with the dress code because of how they were brought up, trading favoritisms under the guise of multiculturalism for loyalty to supervisors at the cost of productivity. permitting lower performance levels from individuals on account of their cultural upbringing, and then demanding higher performance levels from others who come from a more productive cultural background, not having to work with others that are different because they were brought up that way, race, religion, background, and so on. Disallowing a proficient method of doing something because it offends someone of a different culture. Lowering standards for hiring individuals who are less qualified so as not to offend them by giving preference to more highly skilled individuals of another culture. James Thornton. Non-Europeans coming to the U.S. for economic reasons and finding American society and culture very different from the society and culture of the lands of their birth tend naturally to try to alter their adopted land so that it resembles more closely the country they abandoned. But you're in America now. How many times have I heard that? Thomas Jefferson writes, warning against the pitfalls inherent in irresponsible immigration policies and what is today called multiculturalism. They, foreign immigrants, will bring with them the principles of the government they leave, imbibed in their early youth. Or if able to throw them off, it will be in exchange for an unbounded licentiousness, passing as is usual from one extreme to another. It would be a miracle were they to stop precisely at the point of temperate liberty. Their principles with their language they will transmit to their children. In proportion to their numbers, they will share with us in the legislation. They will infuse into it their spirit and warp and bias its direction, and render it a heterogeneous, incoherent, distracted mass. Now, if it was okay to have multiculturalism, but nobody respects any other culture but their own the most, and they're inclusive of one another because of numbers. Alexander Hamilton likewise instructs Americans to heed reality and beware of the hazards of massive immigration by peoples still devoted to their former homelands. Come to America, but adopt our system. No. He declares bluntly that particular attachment to any foreign nation is an exotic sentiment which, where it exists, must derogate from the exclusive affection due to our own country. The best course, Hamilton notes, would be to render the people of this country as homogeneous as possible, for that policy must tend as much as any other circumstance to the permanency of their union and prosperity. Homogeneity, then the overall system. Now, some countries have a basic language, and then you have your local language. What's wrong with that? You have your basic American, whatever it is, setup, culture, and then you're free to exercise your own culture, but not against American culture. Hamilton continues, the influx of foreigners must therefore tend to produce a heterogeneous compound to change and corrupt the national spirit, to complicate and confound public opinion, to introduce foreign propensities. In the composition of society, the harmony of ingredients is all important, and whatever tends to a discordant intermixture must have an injurious tendency. Washington, Franklin, Madison, Adams, Ames, and others spoke similarly. None was afflicted with that strange malady so prevalent today in which any culture on earth, especially the most primitive, is valued more highly than our own. The traditional view insists that humankind possesses a multiplicity of dimensions, that man is an enormously complex creature, that certain flaws in human nature are persistent, and that man's spiritual and cultural attributes are signal components in determining his economic and political life. Radical theorists postulated that man is a wholly malleable creature, the perfect plastic material for experiments in social engineering. The French Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, socialist movements, and the modern welfare state all find their sources in these theories, and the colossal mounds of corpses produced by many of these experiments bear stark witness to the error and ruthlessness of that school of thought. The deliberate forcing together of peoples of unlike or rival cultures is also related to the same fanciful ideas and generates the same tragic sequelae, the ensuing result. Most of the world's societies are not tolerant, not charitable, not magnanimous, and not even-handed towards the representatives of other societies and cultures. Events in history as well as in our own time serve equally to prove the point. Even at this very moment, as we read quietly in the comfort of our homes, human beings are ripping to pieces artificially contrived societies in which culturally disparate populations have grown together. The litany of a human catastrophe is seemingly endless. The murderous conflicts that bedevil Rwanda, Nigeria, South Africa, the Indian subcontinent, and the Balkans are only the most recent illustrations of that phenomena of hostile cultural groups giving vent to an impulsive, so trenchantly described by Dr. Samuel Francis as secret compulsions to spill each other's blood. And so human beings and human society are not nearly so ductile as leftist theories would have us believe. Harold J. Brown, essay on writings of Henry Bergson, published recently. A universal human society is not possible, or not yet possible, because a society can exist only on the basis of shared obligations. And obligations cannot be shared, or cannot be shared only with difficulty where there is no common language or culture. Dr. Brown continues, multiculturalism actually works wherever naked force is employed to make it work. Unquestionably, the foregoing furnishes the reason that the only relatively successful models in history for multicultural or pluralistic societies have been, by necessity, absolutist despotisms, the Roman Empire, the USSR, Tito's Yugoslavia, to mention only three. However strict and edifying Islamic moral teaching may be in Saudi Arabia, however colorful Hindu ceremonies may be in India, however abstruse Buddhist philosophy may be in the Far East, and however passionate the devotees of voodoo may be in Haiti or Brazil, none of these religious views are in harmony with Christianity, nor can they be harmonized with Christian moral teaching and with life in a country where laws and customs are supposed to be based on a Christian worldview. People will kill you for having a different religious point of view, and if their group is in charge, you will die. In contrast, and not all surprisingly, Bill Clinton recently expressed the wish that somehow, between the government, the churches, and the schools, we could teach people not only to resolve their differences, but to understand that America has the opportunity to become the world's first truly multi-ethnic rainbow society where we can embrace our differences. You don't want to embrace a difference that is sub your standard, even if if it isn't. When America was still inwardly robust, and when our belief in the superiority of our way of life was still undiluted, immigrants were not given the chance to do this. Adapt or leave was the operative attitude in those days. And people can still do that. The Eastern establishment, multinational corporations, and giant tax-exempt foundations envision an America where people's lives are no longer animated by their traditions, where there is no genuine heritage worth fighting for, where average Americans are little more than a faceless, mindless, rootless fellahin, and when an upright and alert citizenry has been supplanted by an effortlessly controlled, materialistically oriented herd of consumers driven this way or that by a captive media and by tawdry commercial interests. Charlie Reese wrote, New American Magazine, a majority of immigrants to this country are not Europeans who would at least share our cultural and political traditions. They are largely from areas of the world where the tradition is far from democratic, where violence as a political means of persuasion is a common tool, where authoritarian rule rather than liberty has been the way of life, and where collectivism rather than individualism has been the cultural standard. They just don't mix. Americans are being brainwashed daily that the only virtue is tolerance. Ironically, the people who do their brainwashing are themselves intolerant of Americans, American culture, and our historical European and Mediterranean roots. But in fact, cultural differences do make a difference. The idea expressed in the Declaration of Independence that every person is born free with unalienable rights given to him by God is a uniquely American concept with Anglo-Saxon roots. If you asserted that concept in most countries of the world, the ruling elites would laugh in your face, and in many countries, not even the people believe it. Maybe even by violent reaction, too, if you try to talk the American philosophy into another country as a citizen there. Next, abortion is a personal matter. Oh boy. This next time.